Hello, George Hepworth, Grover Park Consulting. We're building the Lander Trail Foundation, an online searchable database for their book collection of materials related to the history of the Lander Trail. In the previous video, I introduced you to my concept of the difference between global and local variables in the PowerApps environment, which I have come to think of more as the app level and context level variables. The app level variables being those which apply throughout the life of the application, throughout the life of a session working with that application. Regardless of which screen you're on, an app level variable is available to that screen. A context variable, or a local variable, on the other hand, is available only while the specific context or screen in which that variable is used is active. Once that screen is replaced by a different screen, those context variables disappear. I talked about using context variables last time. This time I'm going to talk more about using global variables and how I see their value in PowerApps. I'm also going to introduce a concept which I have come to think of as application bias. And by application bias, I mean the tendency when you are very familiar with one application development environment, as I am with Access. I've worked with Access for a couple of decades. In that time, I have come to assume certain things about the way development works. And when I started working with PowerApps, I brought a lot of those assumptions with me. I read a lot about PowerApps, and I took some assumptions from what I was seeing there. And it turns out that in that process, my application bias had led me down some paths which were really not best practices. And I'm going to show you and explain to you one of those. And in the context of that discussion, also show you how to use a global variable or an app level variable. I've pulled up a volume. It's called The Humor of the American Cowboy, and it is categorized as American Wit and Humor. I'm going to edit this book, starting with the Edit Details. Click the button. I'm going to stick with my same set of controls here, the four combo box controls. I'm going to change this one from a book to a periodical, from good to mint, and from just arbitrarily the second shelf to arbitrarily the bottom shelf. Now, I save it and I go back, and it will take a minute, but the screen will update itself, and we see that the condition has been replaced. And if we go back and look at the details, we'll see these have also been changed. I controlled that originally with global variables. So let's go back and look at that. Take it out of the runtime mode. We'll look at the code behind this Edit Details button. And I'll show you right here where I originally set up global variables. And as I said, this is partly based on my thinking. PowerApps isn't sophisticated enough to do anything else, so I'm just going to have to be very explicit, create a global variable that I can use later on. I set a global variable for each of my four IDs, and these correspond to the combo boxes. They take their values from the publication that we're looking at in this gallery. Global variable for publication is the selected publication in this gallery, and we pass this information on to the edit screen when we navigate to it. So with that, we'll go ahead, move to the edit screen, take it again out of runtime, and look at what happens when this screen appears, or when it becomes very available to us, or visible. Application bias again had led me to create a second set of variables. These are context variables. And all I did was I said, take the value from that global variable set in the prior screen. Again, one screen doesn't talk to another screen directly, but I can pass variables between them. And then I set my local variables my context variables to those values. So here's a redundant use of variables. And then in my controls, I set the default values, the default selected items, to the value of that local context variable. If it came in blank, and I'll explain next how it came in blank, you simply use the default, which is media type 1, which is book. Originally, I had put the same global variable here, the same app level variable here. That's like a prior version of this app. This is a refined version where I took it one step ahead, but still hadn't gotten all the way to the end of the thought process. If it is not blank, if I've passed the value from the publications, then I'm going to use that as my default. And the same is true for these other combo boxes. The default comes from this. So I've got basically a level of redundancy built on my faulty understanding of how PowerApps needed to work. Let's look at one more factor that kind of rounds this out, and then we'll talk about the changes. If I want to add a new book, I click this plus sign. Let's look at the code behind it. Take it out of design view, select the control, look at its onSelect property, and I'm setting my my 4 variables. The first one is the media condition, which is 5, publisher ID, which is a 60, which means unknown, media type, and the shelf. By the way, these are what sometimes people refer to as magic numbers, because there's nothing here to tell you why 60 is the value. In a further refinement in the Access world, I would actually be doing something with enums, enumerations, to try to avoid this magic number that I'm using here. That's the next step of refinement, but that isn't what we're doing quite yet. So I've set these variables in 2 different places, here in the Add option or here in the Edit. Then I took those values when the Edit screen opened and set another set of values. All of that is the result of my lack of sophistication, really, in understanding how best to work with PowerApps and bringing my bias from the Access world, where I want to pass, using OpenArgs, for example, a value to another screen. I don't really need to do that here, and I'll show you that next. Let's start here. These are redundant, so if I remove them, my applications should still run the same way. If I remove them here, again, my application will run the same way, except now I have errors. And those errors result from this redundant step, where I was setting the local variable or the context variable to the value of the app level or global level variable that I had passed to it. Think of this as something like an OpenArgs assignment. By removing those and replacing them with this set of 4 assignments, I have reduced the complexity or the redundant variables. Oops, I missed one. Beg your pardon. Start again. By replacing my original global variable with an assignment of a context variable based on the publication. So I'm going to pass only the publication record, only the record identifying that publication to this screen. And then I'm going to work only with context variables. Let's see how that actually works. We'll go back here, click the plus to add a new record, and these defaults are assigned. And by assigning a 0 to my location, I have a blank result here. If I go back here and set my selection based on a particular publication, the same thing is true. To sum up, by reorienting my thinking away from I'm trying to do the things in PowerApps that I would do in Access and do them the same way, towards what's the most efficient way, the most effective way to use the tools available to me, I refined my thinking and simplified my code. Now, this is not very complex code to begin with, but by rethinking how I was approaching it, I was able to reduce that even further. The global variable, or the app level variable, brings with it the entire record, which is the book. And from that record, I can retrieve each of the properties I need for my defaults for the 4 combo boxes on this screen. At this point, we've covered the difference between context and app level variables, the basic mechanism of passing values from one screen to another. In the Access world, we have either open args in VBA, or we can pop a modal window, a pop-up form on top of another form, and read the values from the second form that way. In the PowerApps world, it's not possible to do that pop-up window over the top of the other window directly. You can, in fact, reference a control on a different screen. In other words, I could say at this point, give me the media condition ID value from the record in the currently selected record in the gallery. That is not a good practice because it forces PowerApps to load that other screen in memory. It's invisible to retrieve that value from that gallery, and that's not an efficient use of resources. We, again, have to reorient our thinking to work effectively in a different environment. That's all I really have to say about that. I hope you have learned something and enjoyed it in the process. If you like what you're seeing, please hit the like button. Subscribe to my channel so you can see future videos, and hit the notify button so you'll be notified that when the next one drops. I'll see you next time.